Some imagery here where we can see the latest on Irma. Winds right now 125 miles per hour, gusting up to 155 miles per hour. The movement, it's been what we call wobbling, okay, where it's going back and forth between west and north and west and north. The question is, when does it finally start to make that really sharp turn to the north? We focus on the maximum wind gusts. Notice for the most part, it's the western half of Florida where we have our strongest winds. Key West, this will be our peak maximum wind gusts around 138 miles per hour. But say up around Fort Myers, 136, even Tampa going to be in the triple digits, right around 116 miles per hour. The track itself will still take it over portions of the Keys and then riding up along the western coast, making it very close call towards Naples, Fort Myers, even into Tampa. So those are going to be the cities of concern going forward in about the next 36 to 48 hours. Here's a look at the forecast radar. So this shows you not just where it's headed, but where some of the heavy rain is going to be as well. When we get to Sunday morning, this is when we really start to see incredibly heavy downpours for cities like Miami into Fort Myers. Then we push into Sunday afternoon and evening. Now Tampa starting to get some incredibly heavy rainfall. And then the system itself begins to make its way into portions of Georgia and also into South Carolina. Overall rainfall totals, we're talking widespread, 6 to 10 inches of rain, but it could even be slightly higher than that. And especially when you get some of those outer bands where you could end up getting incredibly heavy downpours for several hours at a time. But the rain spreads even farther north. So even states like Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina could end up picking up, say, 4 to 6 inches of rain. We've noticed the hurricane watches and warnings continue to spread to the north. Hurricane warnings now extending from the northernmost part all the way down through the entire state. And we now have tropical storm watches in effect for portions of South Carolina as well as Georgia. Anderson?
You know, you talk about that turn. Any way to estimate when that turn north might occur? Because obviously, you know, there are tens of thousands of people watching that very closely because it's going to affect exactly where this thing goes.
Right. Likely it will happen within the next 6 to 12 hours, but you also have to keep in mind that's getting awfully close to when we expect it to cross over the Florida Keys. You've got a couple of things driving it. You've got a high pressure system sitting out here over the open Atlantic. You've got a high pressure sitting right around the Texas coastline. Those two combinations are what's going to be driving it to push that right-hand turn over the main peninsula of Florida. Then you also have that high that's over the main portion of the U.S. that's going to break away. That's what's going to allow the storm, once it crosses into places like Georgia and Tennessee, and take its track from there. But ultimately, Anderson, again, 6 hours versus 12. We know it's likely going to happen in that time period. But if it happens 6 versus 12, there's a huge difference there on who actually will end up taking the ultimate landfall. So again, while we have a range, the opposite ends of that range could mean huge differences for several cities.
Allison, appreciate that update. Chris Cuomo just a few minutes ago told us that we're going to get a band of some of the rain that he experienced in Miami Beach. That's going to be coming to the Fort Myers area. Let's go to Drew Griffin, who's outside the arena that holds about 8,000 people. Drew, first of all, I understand for the thousands of people who've been waiting outside, for those who are still left online, I understand it's already started to rain there.
Yeah, a blast of rain just came through. It subsided just a second, but it created a little bit of a panic. What happened was at the same time they were opening up a second door on this center, the Germain Center, and they're trying to get the people inside now with a little more importance because these squalls are now really beginning to come through. There was a bad tweet that went out not too long ago, Anderson, that said somehow or another this place was going to reach capacity. That is not true. I just want to knock that down for anybody who may be in the viewing area. It's not true. There is plenty of capacity at the Germain Center, and everybody here is going to get in. But obviously the rain has begun. We're seeing the first bands coming through, and they're really rushing now to get these people inside before Irma really strikes. Anderson?
Well, Drew, if you've gotten a band of the rain there, we're expecting it then now in Fort Myers. I'm looking for the sky here, but again, good information. That arena is not that arena is not full. More people can still go there. For anybody in the Fort Myers area who still wants to try to evacuate, the buses, according to the city, were to shut down at 3 o'clock. The shuttles, so you're going to have to figure out a way to get there on your own. but there is still room at those shelters, and the mayor had talked about trying to open up other shelters throughout the day as needed. 211 is the number to call for information and also for help in trying to get to some of those shelters, though that line has been busy, I know, throughout the day. I want to go to Bill Weir, who is in Key Largo, where it's also started to rain pretty hard. Bill, how is it now?
It's so interesting, Anderson. It's like someone flipped a switch and turned on the waterworks. We were just enjoying, calm skies relatively, and then boom, it came on. Now it's easing up a little bit. Ernest Hemingway, who loved the Florida Keys and wrote an Old Man in the Sea, the split personality of the ocean. There's La Mar when it's calm and beautiful. There's El Mar when it sinks your boat and floods your house. And, of course, everybody around the Keys today bracing for El Mar, Irma, in Irma form. It's so interesting, though, also to look at the attitude shift. A couple days ago, very devil-may-care. We're riding it out because that's what we do down here in the Concord public. But last night about 6 o'clock, city managers in Key West had a meeting and came out shaken. And that's when they decided to evacuate 500 prisoners out of the Monroe County Jail down there. That's when they started really sending people north in ways they hadn't seen days earlier, even after the mandatory evacuation. They announced this morning that Key West High School is a refuge of last resort. No services provided. Bring what you need, but pets are welcome there as they're hunkering down for what they were thinking might be the biggest direct hit since the Great Labor Day hurricane of 1935. People have long memories about storms and who survived, what boats survived. About 5 families are actually riding out the storm in this little marina here in Key Largo, not on their boats, but in a stone building right here nearby. There's also a dive shop that has 3 stories made of stone. That is sort of plan C if things get really dicey here today. But we're just bracing to see what comes next, Anderson.
Yeah, people shifting their plans all throughout the day as the winds and the path of this storm has been shifting here further west. Let's go to John Berman, who's standing by in Miami Beach. John, we talked about this earlier today with Chris Cuomo, but it can be so deceptive if you haven't been through one of these hurricanes before, and frankly, no one's been through a hurricane this size, but it can be so deceptive when you look at, the weather for most of the day here in Fort Myers. It's been hot. The sun's been out at times, sometimes just behind the clouds. Haven't really seen a lot of rain. But as we saw, Bill Weir was just talking about in Key Largo, it's like somebody flips a switch and all of a sudden the rain is just torrential.
Yeah, it can change so fast, Anderson. Right here in Miami where we are, it's windy. I mean, the wind is now fairly sustained and fairly strong, 30 to 40 miles an hour, I say. Not yet at the point where it is dangerous for the first responders to still be out. But it is very, very windy now. Not a lot of people out on the streets here by any stretch of the imagination in Miami. More than 600,000 people were under mandatory evacuations in Miami-Dade County, the largest evacuation this county has ever seen. And while maybe now they are not expected to bear the brunt of this storm, officials are pleading with people to still take it seriously, pleading with them, don't go home. If you've evacuated, don't go home because we don't know exactly what's going to get here. The storm could wobble, and even if the storm doesn't wobble, there's going to be hurricane-force winds here almost for sure in the Miami area, and storm surge as well, Anderson. Maybe not the 10 to 15 feet that they're fearing where you are on the West Coast, which sounds terrifying, but 3 feet, maybe up to 6 feet in some areas. In particular concern, you can see behind me right now, there's the causeway. There's a bridge out to Miami Beach. Miami Beach is particularly low-lying. It's one of these barrier islands, mandatory evacuations over that whole island. That has been a cause of particular concern now the entire run-up to Hurricane Irma making impact. Our Kyung La is out on Miami Beach, one of the few people, hopefully, still out on Miami Beach. Kyung, what are you seeing out there?
Well, we're seeing the same sort of winds out here, sustained winds now, and we're just starting to hear from the Miami Beach Fire Department that they're responding to some calls of fallen trees, trying to get through some of that. And the reason why is that the winds are picking up. You can see in the trees here, you can see that palm tree over there. Some of the palm fronds have broken off. And then take a look down there. It's a branch of the tree, but this is what we're beginning to see here. So wind is a concern. The other concern here, and that's something you see over here. The businesses are concerned about the wind, but also the storm surge. It's the storm surge here because it is low-lying that the Miami Beach Police Department has now said if you are out and about, whether it's foot traffic, car traffic, if you have not evacuated, and this is an area under mandatory evacuation, if you are out and about between the hours of 8 p.m. and 7 a.m., this evening, the overnight hours, you will be subject to arrest. They want to try to keep people off the streets. A storm surge of 5 to 10 feet here could mean that you drown. And so that's why we're seeing the Miami Beach Police Department taking that extraordinary measure, telling people to simply get out of the way. John?
It makes so much sense, Kyung, and we hope they are paying attention because to storm surge, there's no defense against storm surge rather than just getting out of the way. Go inland. You don't need to evacuate out of the state of Florida. Just move inland to safer, slightly higher ground. And we hope on both coasts now that people are paying attention to that warning. Storm surge, the real concern from Hurricane Irma as it has now moved past Cuba, very close to making that bend, battering the Keys, and then up into the Florida Peninsula. CNN's live coverage of Hurricane Irma continues right after a quick break.
Interaction with land has brought the peak winds down a little bit, but I don't want people to focus on that because the hazards from Irma are just now arriving through the Florida Keys and South Florida. These outer rain bands are beginning to arrive, so conditions are deteriorating now, and we expect Irma to re-strengthen as it moves out over these very warm waters in the Florida Straits. It's going to have about 12 or maybe even 18 hours over the water before it reaches the Keys, and then perhaps even a little more time over water after it passes the Keys before it finally moves inland somewhere along the west coast of Florida during the late in the day on Sunday or Sunday night. So a very dangerous situation, particularly for the Keys and for the Florida west coast, all the way from the Tampa Bay area southward to Naples. They could see the core of the major hurricane. And as you were just talking about that life-threatening storm surge, the Gulf Coast of Florida is particularly sensitive to storm surge. It's very high inundation values that can extend quite a ways inland. So that's a big concern of ours today.
The topography of the water across southwest Florida, the bathymetry or underwater topography, is different on the southwest side and on the east side. Tell us about how that will affect surge even into the Everglades, Doctor.
Right, yes. The bathymetry on the coastal shelf on the Gulf side is very shallow. So as you walk out into the water, the water doesn't get deep very fast. So all that water that's being pushed by the hurricane, so as Irma might come up like this, the northwesterly winds on the backside of it are going to drive that water, and it piles up, and it can go really far inland here in the Naples area. It can go up these rivers and creeks near Fort Myers and up into the bays. So it can affect millions of people are at risk of life-threatening storm surge in these areas. There still is a significant storm surge risk on the southeast coast as well, particularly in Miami-Dade County along the west side of Biscayne Bay, and as well as in the Florida Keys. They're all at risk of this life-threatening surge event.
Let's shift our attention from Boca down to Miami and even to Homestead. What are the new updates for that as the storm has, let's say, shifted 20 miles to the west? What are your thought processes there?
Well, the surge threat is still there. We could still see 5 to 10 feet of inundation all the way from Boca down around the southwest southern tip of the peninsula. Now, on the east coast, as you mentioned, the storm surge threat doesn't extend as far inland, especially in Palm Beach and Broward counties. But here in Miami-Dade, it goes inland a lot farther along Biscayne Bay. So there's lots of people at risk that have been asked to evacuate for storm surge. And that storm surge threat is going to creep northward along the coast of the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast of Florida as we go through Sunday and even into Monday.
I have not many seconds left. I am a little bit concerned, Doctor, that we flood the Everglades with 12 feet of water, and Miami, let's say West Kendall, can flood from the backside. Are you looking at that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there is the potential for that. That's generally for a slower moving storm that would be a biggest threat for that type of flooding. But there's going to be a lot of water with this storm. There's going to be a lot of rainfall. So there's going to be a lot of flooding problems just in general in the Florida Peninsula, either from storm surge and or the combination of very heavy rain. So everybody's going to want to keep an eye out for that.
Give us an update on what it's looking like.
It is looking like the storm is now moving offshore in Cuba. Great news for the people in Cuba, but now the storm is going to re-intensify in the area, the water between Cuba and Florida, or the Florida Keys. It's called the Florida Straits. 10 to 15 foot on top of land storm surge right where you are. And that's the threat right now. That number went up at the 11 o'clock advisory. We have hurricane warnings all the way to Jacksonville. So this is now going to move up along the spine of Florida. There's the center of the eye moving away from land. It is now able to breathe again. It's going to use that warm water in the Florida Straits to get stronger. We're going to see band after band across parts of Florida. That red box right there, that's a tornado watch box. Not only will you see wind, every storm that comes in can spin. Just spin enough. I mean, just a water spout coming on shore can do damage because water spouts can be 100 miles per hour.
Here from Fort
Not
Myers,
like we're going to
Florida.
see, though, for
just
tomorrow.
Starting to get some wind moving a little bit here in Fort Myers. Frankly, it's been a very deceptive day, as we were talking about earlier with John Berman. The sun was shining. It was very hot. You know, I was putting on, and other people were putting on sunscreen as they were standing outside here. But it is getting a little bit cooler now, and definitely one of these bands of the storm, as we saw with Drew Griffin, who's not too far away at an arena where several thousand people are seeking shelter. Big rain out there. The rain has not yet hit this area of Fort Myers. We'll continue to watch it very closely. I'm joined on the phone by Senator Bill Nelson from the state of Florida. Senator Nelson, as you watch this storm approach your state, I'm wondering, you know, you've seen a lot of storms. What do you think of this one and the track that it's taking thus far?
Well, we saw 48 hours ago that it was starting to shift west. So now, 48 hours later, it's not an East Coast storm. It's going to be a West Coast storm. And the fact that you're there in Fort Myers, the real threat, other than the Florida Keys, which is going to get it hit hard, and if it got to Cat 5 on the Florida Keys, that could give some structural damage to the 7-mile bridge. But that's a whole set of other problems. But coming up the West Coast, if it moves out into the Gulf and parallels the coast, that's the worst of all possible situations, because the counterclockwise rotation takes the water and runs it up the bays like Charlotte Harbor and Tampa Bay. And once, Anderson, it gets up in the bays, there's no place for it to go. So it walls up and it becomes a huge, huge storm surge.
Right. At this point, I mean, they're talking about, for Tampa Bay, estimates of 5 to 8 feet of storm surge. Of course, depending on the wind, you have waves on top of that. And even here, Fort Myers could be 10 to 15 feet. I mean, Senator, for people who are living in a one-level house, I mean, a 15-foot storm surge, that covers a first floor of a house.
Exactly. And then if the storm surge comes at high tide, you just add that much more water.
You know, in terms, we've seen, I mean, I remember back in 2004 covering Hurricane Charlie, and I was talking to the mayor here in Fort Myers. Charlie was on the same track, essentially, coming up this river. You know, it had an adjustment of about 4 degrees, and of course, hit Punta Gorda, which wasn't initially what people expected it to do. I remember, I think I was in Tampa for it, ended up driving to Punta Gorda. Even now, this storm could still move. Even slight changes in degrees make a huge, huge difference.
It could, but you got to give a shout out to the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center and NOAA. All of their assets, they're much more accurate now in their predictions of the path and the intensity since Hurricane Charlie. But you're right, Anderson. Hurricane Charlie was going up the West Coast, and all of a sudden it took a right hook and went right up Charlotte Harbor. Ground zero was Punta Gorda, and that was a big surprise. There had been a lot of people that had evacuated from Tampa to come down to stay in the Holiday Inn in Punta Gorda, and that ended up being ground zero.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody who had evacuated from Miami Beach, was staying in Tampa. I got a text from them this morning saying, where should I go? Should I go back to Miami Beach? Because now Tampa seems to be possibly worse off than Miami was supposed to be. Are you concerned about people getting to shelters? You know, buses here in Fort Myers were supposed to stop at 3 o'clock. We've seen a long line outside the arena where a correspondent has been. It seems like everybody's going to be able to get into that arena, but it seems like there's a lot of people who decided to ride out the storm and then woke up this morning and realized, wait a minute, this storm has moved west. We're now directly in its sights. That's precisely what's happened. And you're not only getting to locations for shelters now. I saw it. I just came from Tampa, from the Hillsborough County Emergency Operations Center. The traffic on Interstate 4 going east is significantly picked up. So that's exactly what people are doing, like your friend that you just mentioned. They had evacuated to the West Coast. Now they're moving off the West Coast back to the east. Yeah, because when I drove here, obviously going west from Miami this morning, there was virtually no traffic heading back to Miami. But as you say now, that has definitely changed. Senator, I appreciate talking to you. We'll talk to you, obviously, in the days ahead. Another short break, but our coverage continues in a moment.
Notice the map. We're going to see the storm move right on up across parts of the Florida Keys at 1:40. Right now, the center of the cone, because the cone is pretty close now. We're less than 20 hours away. We're probably going to be somewhere between Key West and Big Pine Key. It may go to the west of Key West, and that would be terrible for Key West because then you would be on the wrong side, the dirty side, the worst side of the eye. The same place, Anderson, that you're going to be. Look at the radar summary. This is the future radar. By 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, the eye wall over Key West. And by later on in the afternoon, the eye wall right over you with wind speeds in excess of 130 miles per hour and that storm surge being deadly. Water kills more than the wind kills in a hurricane. You need to be out of that water, away from the water. I mean, Chris Cuomo's been talking about it all day, how it's been coming up in Miami because the water in the air is just pouring on shore here. Well, tomorrow, the water will be pouring into southwestern Florida.
But what are you seeing, and what does it add to your expectations?
The eye now of Irma has moved offshore of Cuba. Our Patrick Ottman right there. So he's finally going to get away from that purple band. And why is it purple and not red anymore? Because that's the next level of coldness on the satellite. The storms are getting stronger around the eye, and the eye will begin to get deeper in pressure, lower in pressure, and the storm will continue to strengthen as it is right now. A Hurricane Hunter aircraft is in the plane trying to get there. The Hurricane Hunters will probably be another hour before they actually locate the center and tell us what the new pressure is. Fort Myers, your wind gust will be 136. Now, this isn't all at the same time. This is storm total. As it comes across Key West, our winds are going to be 129. You get up to Orlando, 123. Now, I remember what Charlie Jean Francis did across parts of Central Florida because my parents lost the roof twice that year. And this is going to take off roofs again, not just shingles. This will be a devastating storm for Central Florida, Tampa, Fort Myers, Naples, all the way down to Key West. Here is the latest European model. Now, the new one is out 24 hours. So we're still waiting for the rest of the run to happen. It's the model that models the atmosphere. But what I just watched at the 24-hour model run, the eye, the center of the eye, is west of Key West, just by a little bit, like by 3 miles, just over Sunset Key. That will put Summerland, Coppet, that will put Big Pine Key, that will put Shark Key in the eye wall. Likely 140-mile-per-hour winds, and, of course, Key West, because I just said that. Fort Myers, Naples, 100-mile-per-hour winds, at least for you. Just told you, 125 possible. And then where people are evacuating to, Atlanta, Athens, and Macon, winds there will be 75 miles per hour. It's the surge again for you in Miami. For Chris, 4 to 6. For you, Anderson, I'm afraid almost 10 to 15 feet above normal dry ground. Don't worry about the tides back and forth. Above normal dry ground. If your house is less than that, above sea level, you need to go. Because not only will it be, or could it be 15 feet, there could be 20-foot waves on top of that. Time to go. Anderson, you too.
All right, Chad, thank you very much. And I just want to
tropical winds, when they're going to really start to get hurricane force winds. Just what do the next 24 hours look like?
Every time, Anderson, a squall goes by, an outer band, the winds are going to pick up. And every hour a squall goes by, that pickup is going to be greater than the hour before. So I think the tropical storm force winds are already hitting Marathon, Big Pine, all the way down to Key West. That's already a given. I've already seen a gust to 60 at the Marathon airport. The storm is off now the coast of Cuba. It's gaining strength. We will eventually begin to see hurricane force winds tomorrow afternoon in Miami. This is the map now of the brand new European model, and I'll get to the track in a second. These are the max winds that we're going to see over the entire storm, not just 1 minute, 1 hour, or whatever. The entire storm. Your max wind in Key West is going to be 138, Naples 132, Fort Myers 136, Orlando, because the storm has shifted even more toward Tampa. Now you're not over 100, you're 94. Not that you can tell the difference, but it's better. 116 for Tampa, losing shingles, losing roofing boards, an awful lot of damage in Tampa that they weren't expecting because the models, as they try to simplify the atmosphere earlier this week, had it like this, and then like this, and then like this. We're waiting for the turn, and it never happened. And now we're over Key West, just to the west possibly of you, and then making landfall just south of Sarasota. Landfall is going to be a long process, because the eye wall will be on Florida's coast for a long time tomorrow afternoon, doing significant damage from Fort Myers all the way through Venice and all the way into Tampa Bay. This is the model as it's going to be moving on up to the north. There's your latest track. This now, I will get rid of this. This now is what the European model has been working better than the American model, at least for this storm, is doing. You leave Cuba, you go 8 miles west of Key West, which puts Key West on the bad side of the eye, floods all of Big Pine, all the way through Shark Key and the like, the Naval Air Station there, moves just to the west of Punta Gorda and makes landfall just south of Tampa. That is the latest forecast track from the European model. I said it before, I said it at 8 a.m., I said it at noon. Irma doesn't know that there's an American model or a European model. It's going to do what it wants to do. You have to pay attention if this goes into Tampa Bay.
All right, John Berman here in Miami. The view you're seeing right now was shot a little while ago here in Miami. More than 20 cranes, giant cranes up in this city. A sign of the booming economy here. There's a lot of construction here. The problem is they couldn't take these cranes down in time. They had to leave them up. And the booms, those arms, looks terrifying when they move. They're designed to move. They serve like a sort of weather vane. If they tied them down, it would be like a sail and blow a whole lot over. That resistance would be dangerous. So they let them twist like that. It can be a terrifying sight for people in a city like Miami. The building officials here in the city sent a note out to the population saying if you live in a building near one of these cranes, you should evacuate. There is obvious concern about that. Just one of the things we're watching here in Miami as the wind has picked up. It is now consistently windy here, a wind of about 30 miles an hour blowing fairly consistently, gusts a little more than that. Just starting to drizzle right now as these bands move through. Let's go to Allison Chinchar in the CNN Weather Center to get a sense of what we will be feeling here in the Keys and maybe most importantly on the west coast of Florida and when. Allison.
That's right, John. So we take a look at the current numbers that we have right now. Irma is a Category 3 storm, but a very strong Category 3 storm. Winds right now 125 miles per hour, just 5 miles per hour stronger, and it would be a Category 4 storm. So I want you to understand, you're talking a difference of 5 miles per hour here. So don't focus on the category number so much, but the intensity of the winds. Movement is west at about 9 miles per hour, but we have started to see at least a slight shift off to the north as well. One of the big concerns is going to be maximum wind gusts. Take a look at some of these numbers. Key West, we're talking around 138 miles per hour. This will be at the peak as the storm is crossing over that region. Naples and Fort Myers also in that 130 to 130 mile per hour range. Even Tampa likely to be around 116. Now the East Coast, while it may not be as strong, you're still talking pretty strong wind gusts. In fact, Orlando looking at 95 miles per hour for their peak wind gust. Storm surge is also going to be a huge threat threat with this particular storm. We got some updated numbers a few hours ago that really made these numbers rise. In fact, especially in the southwest portion, say Naples down towards Key Largo, we're talking 10 to 15 feet. Miami down towards Key West, 5 to 10 feet. Even around the Fort Myers area, you're talking 6 to 10 feet. The numbers, however, you have to understand what they mean. So let's take a look at this, for example. Just to talk about storm surge. 10 feet is what an average first-story building is. So if you have storm surge of 10 feet, and keep in mind, some places we're actually forecasting higher than 10 feet. Some areas it could be as much as 15 feet, which means it would start creeping into the second story of a home or a business or something like that. But this is just the storm surge. Now you also have to factor in the waves. This is where true inundation takes place, because it's not just the amount of rain, or not just the amount of water that has been pushed in from the storm surge, but those waves, the crests of those waves can add even a couple more feet on top of that. So you talk about 5 to 6 feet. You know, if you've got a person that's 6 feet tall, you are now completely submerged underwater, and you've got the waves moving everything around. This is where it gets very concerning, especially those higher amounts too. You could have cars submerged. So if you take that car out onto a street as the storm surge is pushing in, you will have absolutely no control over that vehicle, even though the car may not be fully submerged at that point. Now, when we talk about the track, this is the part that everybody is concerned about, because you want to know where landfall is expected to be. However, because of the size of the storm, at this point, that really is just semantics. Everybody around Florida is going to get some impact from this storm. Some will just get bigger impacts than others, namely the winds. Here's what we expect. We do expect it to increase back to a Category 4 strength storm as it crosses over the Keys and continues its way up the west coast. Right now, landfall could be anywhere from, say, Naples to Fort Myers, even up around Tampa. And Tampa is a huge city. A lot of people in Tampa did not necessarily evacuate, especially several days ago, thinking this was mostly going to be an East Coast main landfall of a storm. But that is now starting to change. Then we see the track kind of push further into the north, states like Alabama, Georgia, as well as Tennessee. And the other thing, John, to note is we are still talking a pretty good amount of rain. We've talked about storm surge. We've talked about wind. But don't count out the rain. We could be looking at widespread rainfall totals of 6 to 12 inches of rain.
All right, Allison Chinchar, an important forecast, the point that people should really listen to there, where you're talking about impact on the state of Florida. The impact of a hurricane will be the entire state of Florida. The eye may hit on the west coast, but you're going to feel the storm force winds, and you're going to see the storm surge in water like this all across the southern part of the state. The storm surge clearly what is worrying officials the most. You can hear it in the voice of the governor. You can hear it in the voice of the FEMA director in Washington. They're watching that very, very carefully, particularly on the west coast, where they could see a storm surge from 10 to 15 feet. Let's go over to the west coast. I want to talk to Ben McMillan. He is a storm chaser. He's in Punta Gorda, Florida right now, right on the west. Punta Gorda, by the way, has seen its share of hurricanes in the past. And Ben, you have a fairly alarming prediction of what could happen, particularly on the west coast, because of Hurricane Irma. You say some parts of Florida could end up looking like a third world country. Why?
One of the big issues with that storm surge that you were talking about is it plows through everything in its path. Buildings, cars, vehicles, and even people. And that is one of the most damaging forces of nature. All that water coming up from the bay up over these walls and into the city, guys. We're talking about 10 to 15 foot of surge. So these walls aren't going to be any match for all that water coming up out of the ocean.
Now, I'm over here in Miami, where they've been preparing really for several days right now. One of the things that has concerned me is that maybe people on the west have been a little complacent. What's your take on that? What have you seen?
As we've driven north today from the Fort Myers area up to now Punta Gorda, we've seen a lot of people out and about. Some people even going about their normal daily routines. And that's the big concern here, is that people might not have gotten enough of the urgency that the state officials had been trying to communicate, because so much of that effort was directed towards the East Coast. But we want to tell you now, if you live on the west coast of Florida and you're being asked to evacuate, please go now. This threat is real.
Yeah, so a couple 100,000 people in Pinellas County, that's St. Petersburg, issued evacuation orders. They're watching that very, very carefully. And Ben, just because you've seen storms like this, you watch all of these storms very carefully. People think hurricane, they think the winds. They always keep track of the wind strength. And now after Hurricane Harvey, people have thought about flooding, but storm surge is something completely different. And in some ways, one of the most dangerous things that can happen in a hurricane. Why?
Just because of the power of all that water. Winds can be stopped by stronger buildings, stronger construction. But when you have that much force coming up, especially out of something like the ocean, where there's an unlimited supply of all that water, almost anything could be toppled.
And of course, on the West Coast, you have these bays. There are a lot of people now saying that the concern about the path of this storm, maybe even if it's slightly off the West Coast, it will push the water up into the bays on the west, particularly, Tampa Bay is something. That city, the city of Tampa, lies so close to the water there on that bay. How bad could it get there?
Well, unfortunately, John, Tampa, a metro of over 3 million people, that's a lot of folks that I don't know if we're going to get them all out in time. So we could see serious consequences if this storm shifts any more to the west. As your meteorologists have been saying, there's going to be strong winds and storm surge on the eastern part of that storm. The northeast quadrant is where we watch very closely for some of the most dangerous conditions.
All right, Ben McMillan for us in Punta Gorda. You're going to have your work cut out for you the next few days. I hope people heed your warnings there. As we've been saying, up here in Miami or over here in Miami, the winds have picked up consistently, blowing now fairly strongly. Going to feel these winds for some time all over the southern part of Florida as the storm moves up west to where Anderson Cooper is in Fort Myers. Anderson?
Yeah, John, thanks very much. I want you to meet Captain Jay Rodriguez. He's commander of hurricane operations for the city of Fort Myers for the police department. How are things going?
So far, so good. Our community's listening. We're starting evacuations and actually wrapping them up, giving some rides to some people that still need it, but overall, very good.
The buses, the public buses that were in operation to try to get people to shelters that are offered if people call 211, those shut down at 3 o'clock. So if people don't have a vehicle, is there any way for them to still get to a shelter if they want?
Yeah, we still need them to call us. They can call 211, and we're doing our best. Fire, EMS, and police, so we're going to help them to get them out and to get them to a shelter.
It seems like a lot of those people were people who thought they could ride it out, and then obviously when the storm shifted west, suddenly realized, wait a minute, this is a different category.
You're exactly right, and that's just it. They waited a little too long, but we're going to do our best to try to get them out, and that's why we just say, please get out as fast as you can.
Yeah, you've been through a lot of storms before. You were through Hurricane Andrew, right?
Yes, right?
So how did that inform the way you react to this?
I take, as a native of Florida, I take these very seriously. I did survive Andrew, and that's a piece of my public to my community. I've been doing that for a week now. Please get out. Don't take this lightly. And I moved out myself and my family just to show that I'm serious about this.
It's one of the, it is so deceptive when if you're hanging out here today, it seems calm, and then all of a sudden it can change on a dime.
It's the calm before the storm.
Right.
Yeah, and if you're from Florida or lived anywhere with hurricanes, you know what's coming, and this is a very serious one.
Right. In terms of the aftermath, for police, if there were 911 calls during the storm, obviously it can be too dangerous for police, for firefighters, for EMS, or anybody to go out. You got to wait. What are the priorities? Because in many cases, you got to get the roads clear before you can even get anywhere.
Right, we work with fire and EMS, and we have an emergency response team with chainsaws and stuff like that, and we prioritize all the calls. So we still take the calls, we prioritize them, and we'll, as soon as it's safe for our guys to go out there, we go by the highest priority and we work our way there. Obviously, our hospitals, our shelters are main importance to clear the areas around there so we can use those facilities.
So to people who are listening right now, whether they're considering going to a shelter or just staying at home or trying to figure out what to do in the next couple hours, what's your message?
My message is if you're going to stay there, please hunker down. Please call us. We'll get to you as soon as we can. But understand that we're no good if I can't get there, if my people can't get there. So just pray or do whatever it is you do to just stay safe, and we'll be there for you at the outcome. We have a lot of plans in place for what happens after the storm.
Captain, I appreciate all your efforts. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, good luck to you. A lot more to cover here in Fort Myers. Also, John Berman in Miami, and of course, all our correspondents all around. We'll be right back. And what time is the next update in terms of the track? Is it 5 p.m.? Because the one, obviously at 11, we got new numbers on storm surge, which were frankly alarming for areas along the west all the way up into Tampa.
Yeah. At this point, the Hurricane Center can put out a new track anytime that it wants to. It's up to them. If they see a wobble or a wiggle and it makes a difference, they can change everything in a discussion and an email, honestly. Right now, the next forecast change will be 5 p.m.
We'll be watching, obviously, for.
Where we're going. There you go. All right. Steve and Julie, good to see you guys.
Yes. What better people to go to, I guess, in
Absolutely.
terms of
nice to see you too, Jen. And yeah, we'll be obviously watching this very closely for the next couple of days. We'll be here with you night and day to help talk with you and through this system as it continues to move toward the Bay Area. We've been watching it, Julie, and it looks like, and especially on radar, and this is an important point to make, as I learned with several hurricanes, is that when you actually get land-based radar to actually observe it, you can notice those changes a little bit better. Satellite is awesome and it's excellent, but when you actually can use radar, as we're using Key West Doppler radar to actually see this storm, we can actually see it just a little bit clearer. So we did notice maybe just a little bit more of a northwesterly turn, and we've been waiting for that turn around the western side, haven't we?
Absolutely. We've been waiting for that for days now because, of course, that northerly turn is going to depend upon where that track moves up the state of Florida. So we've been watching that eye right along the northern coast of Cuba, and you can see probably within the last hour or so, we noticed that little bit of a northern jog. Still has that westerly component, so not moving north yet, but moving a little bit northwesterly, it looks like. As of the official 2 p.m. update from the National Hurricane Center, though, this is moving west at about 9 miles per hour, pressure 941 millibars, and maximum wind sustained at 125 miles per hour. And that's been due to some interaction with Cuba, has weakened the storm since yesterday. And the latest track that came out, we'll show you that. You can see expected to intensify a bit as we head towards tomorrow, and this storm potentially makes its landfall in the Keys.
It's moving across the Keys, and they've ordered evacuations there, and we've heard local officials say there, media saying it's like this may not be a survivable situation down in parts of the Keys with the type of storm surge they've seen. With Wilma in 2005, the storm passed 70 miles, 75 miles to the north, and it actually flooded a lot of Key West as it passed the storm. I think it was a Category 2 or 3 at that point. So that just gives you the idea of the kind of inundation and the susceptibility to the low levels that they have in the Keys for areas to flood. So this will be pretty brutal, especially on the eastern side, but also with that counterclockwise motion. It could also push, if there is an island, depending on where the landfall takes place, you might even see kind of a northern surge with the stronger winds coming back from the north, pushing to the south around the western side of the system.
Yeah, definitely a very serious threat setting up for the Keys. And then the system, while on the current track, continues to make its way to the northwest, maintaining strength. You know, it's going to be moving over warm Gulf waters at this point. Not a lot of shear it's going to be facing. At that point, we're expecting it to still be a Category 4 storm. And the latest track that came in at 11 a.m. had this storm approaching maybe near the Fort Myers area, but it's still not exact. Some folks have been asking, could it shift a little? And of course it could, because it depends on the northerly turn. You notice the cone gets more narrow, though, as we get closer to the event. So it looks like at this point we're looking at potentially another landfall in southwest Florida near Fort Myers.
And we've been saying this for several days, that this track will shift. We've been saying every time we show you the track is it's going to change. This will change. This will change. And this may change. And it, however it changes, as we've learned throughout the week, can affect the Bay Area and different parts of the Bay Area in different ways. The eastern side is typically the stronger wind part of the storm because it's the advancing part. But as it gets farther west, that's when we start to get concerned about water issues. And in particular down in Charlotte Harbor there, southward facing areas where we get this surge of water. They're talking about a storm surge over 10 feet in some of these areas. And as we move up the coast and the storm has maintained some strength, and you've seen over the past couple of days, you see that Monday position there at 8 a.m. with 115 mile per hour winds. Well, that was 2 days ago, the Hurricane Center had forecast a tropical storm in that location. And that's because conditions change and forecasts change. We understand that. But that's what we're telling you about. Things can change with the storm over time. And with the winds coming northwest and then west around the center of the storm toward the coastal areas into rivers, bays, inland areas, that can slow even the high tides trying to come back out again. And that's where you have the flood. And we'll show you the graphic about the high tides to give you a rough idea. But you really have to watch those high tides, especially on Monday. Of course, the concern before that would be wind primarily and some coastal flooding, but wind primarily, and especially in areas just east of the center of the storm where it's actually going to pass. And right now we have the rough area where the center part of it would pass in this forecast, and that can change, as we always say. The eastern side, we're talking about Polk County, sections of Hillsborough County, and we're talking about gusts when we're in the Category 3 range of 100 miles per hour, even plus in some areas. Certainly hurricane force, which is above 70, say 5 miles per hour. And that can be quite scary, dangerous, and destructive, but you add to that additional winds, and that can be very destructive.
And, you know, the exact impacts will depend on, again, as the exact track gets narrowed down. We have a pretty good idea right now, but you'll notice our spaghetti models in pretty good agreement. At this point, as of today, we're expecting it to roll through near the Fort Myers area and then continue that turn north and moving right through the Tampa Bay area, kind of right through the heart of us is where most of the models are aligned at this point. Now, we know these models can change, of course, over the course of days, but at this point, they are in agreement with that. And we've been seeing that shift. You know, a couple of days ago, it really looked like it was almost going to move the East Coast.
Irma
Even
here
now,
from
it's
Fort Myers, Florida, where it has been deceptively calm in terms of the weather throughout the day. We've got a little bit of gust of winds just in the last few minutes, but really nothing serious, nothing to really indicate the monster storm, the deadly storm that is to come. And the people here in Fort Myers woke up today realizing that because the storm had shifted to the west. They're talking about storm surge down in Naples, which isn't too far from here, south of here, in the 10 to 15 feet range in the Centennial Park area where we are right now. If it raises 10 feet, this area is going to be flooded. 15 feet, there's no telling how much of this area will be flooded. This is actually evacuation zone B, they call it. Evacuation zone A, there was already a mandatory evacuation for. Then earlier today, they also called out a mandatory evacuation for this area. B basically stretches south of here and also west across the river. So it's a really big area. They've been sending out police with loudspeakers saying, look, this is now a mandatory evacuation zone, trying to get as many people as possible to the shelters. Because frankly, there's a lot of people who have just thought, look, you know, it's Miami. This is going to be an East Coast storm. It's Miami that's going to get the worst of this. It is a whole different story right now as we continue to track where this storm is exactly. I want to check in with Brian Todd, who's in West Palm Beach. Brian, it looks like it's not going to be as bad there as it might have been. I'm wondering what you're hearing from people and what you're seeing.
Well, Anderson, the streets have gotten a lot more deserted here because the wind has started to kick up. We were told by our weather people at CNN that we could expect tropical storm force winds about now. We're starting to experience those. White caps here on the Intercoastal Waterway. Storm surge is a concern because it could lap up and wash through this area and inundate it with water if the storm surge plus the high tide combine with each other. Less than an hour ago, they ratcheted up those warnings that you were talking about, going door to door with loudspeakers. They ratcheted up that pressure on people to stay inside. Less than an hour ago, a curfew went into effect. They do not want to see people out here on these streets. Once in a while, an odd vehicle will pass by, but we're not seeing much traffic or many people out on the streets now. People seem to be abiding by that curfew. Now, we talk about the danger of cranes. We've got a double whammy here because we've got two cranes here. This one is bracketed down about halfway up. That bracket up there is securing it. But there's another one over here, just to my left. We're going to walk a little bit over here. This is a large construction site, looks like it's a condominium being built here. That one is also bracketed down about halfway up. And as we've been talking about all day here and in Miami, these top booms of these cranes are going to be allowed to swing, and it's going to look pretty ominous when they're allowed to swing, but they are designed to do that. We had a lady, though, just come and tell us that who lives in that apartment building over there, she's concerned that crane may topple and hit her apartment building. We've got apartment buildings over here and a church over here. If these cranes come down, those places could be vulnerable. Anderson?
Yeah, Brian, I know in Miami, certainly we saw, they were securing those cranes as much as they could. But as you said, they allow the outer arm of that crane to basically act like a weather vane. That's actually safer. We'll obviously continue to watch all the construction sites. But Brian, in West Palm Beach, as elsewhere in Florida, building codes have changed in the wake of Andrew, as people probably know by now. So newer structures are built much more solidly, supposed to be able to withstand strong storms.
That's right, they are, and they're built to code here. Andrew was the storm that really changed that equation all throughout South Florida, Anderson, as you know. All of these buildings are built to code. However, we were looking at one hotel not far from here, and those people told us that they were built only to withstand a Category 2. So not everybody is building to withstand a 4, despite what you may think about, certain standards here. However, a lot of these buildings seem very solid and secure, but when you've got, 130-mile-per-hour winds possibly. Here it might be not quite as strong, but, they're going to threaten some structures. They're going to rip whole sections of roof off other structures probably. So those are things you have to watch out for. This construction site is kind of that in a microcosm. Look at all the loose stuff that's here. Now, they've secured a lot of this, but a lot of this could be flying around tomorrow. So it's the flying debris, Anderson, at the height of these storms that is very, very dangerous. Not as dangerous as you've heard Chad and Allison and our other weather people say that the flooding is, because that is the thing that kills the most people. But flying debris, flying shingles and flying sections of rooftops, that's going to be a big concern, in addition to these babies right behind me, these cranes.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons people need to stay indoors, not just because of the surge and the floodwaters and the chance of drowning, but again, those projectiles, when it is dark out and that wind is whipping. I mean, I've been out there as you have and so many others. You don't know what's coming. You can't see what's coming towards you until often it's too late. We're going to continue to check in with Brian. We're going to take a short break as our coverage from Florida, from all points in southern Florida and beyond, continues.
The exact opposite, and a lot of folks are wondering what caused that. And again, it's all due to this area of high pressure out to the east of us.
That big ridge that extends out into the Atlantic, and kind of the western edge of it kind of nudges back toward the state of Florida. And we're also watching the trough to the north as well, a low pressure trough. And what the storm is doing is looking for that weakness around the western side. How strong is it? How weak is it? The weaker it is, the quicker that it would turn to the north. But in this case, as we've seen, that ridge was perhaps a little bit stronger than the computer models thought. And that's why the track has slowly shifted west. But if you think about it, we were talking about this 4 or 5 days out, and the track was across the state, and it's still across the state. So they've been fairly consistent within, say, within 100 miles. But, within 2 days out, the historical average for an error is 90 miles. 90 miles.
Right.
So when you look at these tracks, know that there's still a lot of error. These tracks are not perfect, these forecast tracks, these computer models. So that's what's the difficult part, is living with the uncertainty of that track. But this is the current track, and these are the effects.
And you can see then kind of takes the turn north and then kind of very quickly loses its intensity as it heads into the southeast, kind of in the long term. And of course, hurricane warnings have been posted for the entire Tampa Bay area. At this point, we are pretty certain that every county in the Tampa Bay area is going to feel those hurricane force winds. They are going to see the heavy rain from this. And, we also have the threat of isolated tornadoes as this storm passes as well within those rain bands that whip around.
And you can find that hurricane guide on our WFLA.com website. And you can look up your area and see what kind of flood
is in the Weather Center. Allison, let's bring us up to date.
Right, Anderson. So we take a look at what we've got for right now. Again, you've got some imagery here where we can see the latest on Irma. Winds right now 125 miles per hour, gusting up to 155 miles per hour. The movement, it's been what we call wobbling, okay, where it's going back and forth between west and north and west and north. The question is, when does it finally start to make that really sharp turn to the north? We focus on the maximum wind gusts. Notice for the most part, it's the western half of Florida where we have our strongest winds. Key West, this will be our peak maximum wind gust around 138 miles per hour. But say up around Fort Myers, 136, even Tampa going to be in the triple digits, right around 116 miles per hour. The track itself will still take it over portions of the Keys and then riding up along the western coast, making a very close call towards Naples, Fort Myers, even into Tampa. So those are going to be the cities of concern going forward in about the next 36 to 48 hours. Here's a look at the forecast radar. So this shows you not just where it's headed, but where some of the heavy rain is going to be as well. When we get to Sunday morning, this is when we really start to see incredibly heavy downpours for cities like Miami into Fort Myers. Then we push into Sunday afternoon and evening. Now Tampa starting to get some incredibly heavy rainfall. And then the system itself begins to make its way into portions of Georgia and also into South Carolina. Overall rainfall totals, we're talking widespread 6 to 10 inches of rain, but it could even be slightly higher than that, and especially when you get some of those outer bands where you could end up getting incredibly heavy downpours for several hours at a time. But the rain spreads even farther north. So even states like Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina could end up picking up, say, 4 to 6 inches of rain. We've noticed the hurricane watches and warnings continue to spread to the north. Hurricane warnings now extending from the northernmost part all the way down through the entire state. And we now have tropical storm watches in effect for portions of South Carolina as well as Georgia. Anderson?
You know, you talk about that turn. Any way to estimate when that turn north might occur? Because obviously, you know, there are tens of thousands of people watching that very closely because it's going to affect exactly where this thing goes.
Right. Likely it will happen within the next 6 to 12 hours, but you also have to keep in mind that's getting awfully close to when we expect it to cross over the Florida Keys. You've got a couple of things driving it. You've got a high-pressure system sitting out here over the open Atlantic. You've got a high pressure sitting right around the Texas coastline. Those two combinations are what's going to be driving it to push that right-hand turn over the main peninsula of Florida. Then you also have that high that's over the main portion of the U.S. that's going to break away. That's what's going to allow the storm, once it crosses into places like Georgia and Tennessee, and take its track from there. But ultimately, Anderson, again, 6 hours versus 12. We know it's likely going to happen in that time period, but if it happens versus 12, there's a huge difference there on who actually will end up taking